Excellencies, distinguished young African diplomats and associates, partners and friends, thank you for the invitation to join the Forum of Young African Diplomats and Associates here in Addis Ababa. I'm particularly glad to be with you on a theme that goes to the heart of Africa's unfinished struggle for economic sovereignty: debt, development finance, and reform of the international financial architecture. Let me start with a simple proposition. Africa's debt challenge is not primarily a morality tale about borrowing too much. It is a political economy story about living without certainty, without predictable cash flows, without fair pricing of risk, and without a global system that rewards long-term transformation. Debt is often the symptom, but the cause is an architecture that keeps Africa structurally excluded from certainty. In other words, we need to distinguish between symptom and cause. To understand this relationship, I want to walk you through 6 analytical building blocks. Think of these as layers of diagnosis, each one revealing a deeper structural issue. Then, I will translate what these building blocks mean for you, for your work as young diplomats. Building block 1. Africa's underperformance is by design, not accidental. When we look at Africa's development outcomes, it is tempting to blame the latest shock: COVID-19, war, climate disasters, commodity volatility. Those shocks are real. But if we are honest, the deeper red line in Africa's trajectory predates all of them. It reflects a persistent model that has repeatedly failed to translate global commitments into systemic implementation by design. The root cause is not simply external shocks. It is an ineffective international cooperation model that fails both sides, those who give and those who receive. Too often, the conversation centers on finding more money and calling for more aid. So the first question we should ask is not how do we find more money? The question is why, after decades of conferences, pledges, and projects, are we still producing high activity and low structural transformation? Building block 2. Why debt distress keeps returning? Africa's exclusion from certainty. Now we come to the debt. Africa's debt distress is often portrayed as stemming from fiscal indiscipline and overborrowing. This story is incomplete and in many cases misleading. The deeper issue is Africa's lack of control over its economic and financial flows and the systemic failure to generate predictable cash flows, even while enormous value leaks outside our economies. This causes a chain reaction. When cash flows are uncertain, the cost of capital rises. When the cost of capital rises, countries borrow more expensively. When borrowing is expensive, debt service crowds out social spending and investment. Then, the same countries are told to tighten belts while still being charged a risk premium that reflects global perceptions more than domestic fundamentals. This is why economic sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a financial condition. The ability to mobilize domestic resources efficiently and fairly, the ability to manage risk and credibility, the ability to build pipelines that are investable, the ability to access capital at a cost aligned with long-term development, not short-term volatility. In the presentation, I highlight a single country example to show the absurdity of the model. Low ODA inflows for that country in specific, $4 billion, coexist with very large losses from illicit financial flows, $18 billion. Africa begs for $4 billion, while Africa lost $18 billion on an annual basis. This is the absurdity of the model. Major ODA dependence in social sectors and debt service that can approach a majority of the national budget, at the same time losing $18 billion annually. The point is not about the specific country. The point is the structural trap. Countries are coached to live on volatility, then blamed for being unable to plan. Building block 3, the opportunity, Seville and the pivot from projects to institutions. This is why the Seville commitment from the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in 2025 matters. Seville is a political signal that the world recognizes the need to reform the system, to reduce borrowing costs, scale investment, and place domestic public resource mobilization and institutional capacity at the core. And here is the crucial pivot that needs to happen: from projects to institutions. Seville gives us permission and obligation to stop confusing projects with development, to focus instead on strengthening the engine of delivery, ministers of finance, local governments, education and health systems, regulators, labor markets. For young diplomats, you are the generation that must help African states insist on a new global contract. Cooperation that strengthens systems rather than substitutes for them. Financing that supports predictable cash flows rather than permanent firefighting. An international architecture that prices African risk fairly and consistently. But demanding a new global contract requires understanding the rules of the current game. And what is the game? Building block 4. The relationship between globalization and multilateralism and its two functions. Globalization as a DNA. It is not designed to solve inequality. It is designed to expand markets and extract value efficiently. As the presentation states, globalization consistently seeks new markets and resources and serves the bottom line, not global equity. After World War II, multilateral institutions emerged: IMF, World Bank, WTO, primarily to facilitate economic expansion, identify trade rules, financial stability mechanisms, and global value chains. But globalization predictably produces imbalances, inequality, environmental degradation, and social fractures. These are not anomalies. They are the natural outcomes of expansion logic left unchecked. This is why globalization requires multilateralism for two distinct functions. Function one, paving the way function, facilitating globalization through rules, markets, trade, and finance, IMF, World Bank, and WTO. Function two, addressing imbalances, cooperative and regulatory mechanisms to mitigate globalization's adverse effects, the UN system, and international cooperation. Now comes the turning point over time. Function one crowded out function two. What do I mean by this? This crowding out produces structural weaknesses that you must recognize as partners, not accidents. Regulatory deficits, weak global political leadership and accountability, slow multilateral process, erosion of trust, drift toward fragmented alternatives. And here is the bridge to your team. When multilateralism stops taking care of imbalances, the costs don't disappear. They are transferred. They fall disproportionately on countries and regions that already live with less certainty. Countries with thinner fiscal buffers, weaker bargaining power in value chains, and higher exposure to external shocks. The rules of the game matter because they determine a country's access to the most valuable asset in development, predictability. Building block 5. How the crowding out produces a misprofiling of Africa. Africa's misprofiling is not a misunderstanding. It is an outcome of the architecture. When function 2, addressing imbalances, weakens, development cooperation shifts from systemic regulation to a narrow substitute, projects, an attempt to patch outcomes without changing incentives. That is how multilateralism's second function, addressing imbalance, gets reduced to an operation model. Deliver programs, manage symptoms, report outputs. The result? The international cooperation system, multilateral and bilateral, gets confined to an ODA broker role by design. Once the institutions charged with function 2, addressing imbalances, are pushed into that space, a particular profile of Africa becomes convenient, almost necessary for the model to reproduce itself. The multilateral system has historically profiled Africa as a continent primarily in need of external financial assistance. This is not accurate. Africa generates significant resources, but struggles to mobilize them effectively. This wrong profile has far-reaching consequences. It reinforces an aid-driven mindset. It shapes the multilateral delivery model as a broker between donors and African nations. It avoids addressing Africa's real constraints, but misprofiling is mutual. Africa's perception of the UN as primarily a source of financial aid is also outdated. Global liquidity is largely in the private sector. When Africa pressures the UN system to bring money, to provide financial resources, it pulls the organization away from its comparative advantage: policy advisory and capacity building. Here's how the causal chain tightens. Crowding out weakens multilateralism's ability to correct imbalances. Development cooperation becomes projectized, and UN is confined to an ODA broker logic. Wrong profiles become normalized. Africa as aid dependent, the UN as financier. Once these profiles are normalized, they generate a structural mismatch that looks normal and therefore becomes repeatable. African needs are predictable financing, capable institutions, and investable pipelines. And the supply model: fragmented projects, short cycles, earmarked funding. The result: high activity, low structural transformations. Incentives then lock it in: earmarking, short cycles, parallel implementation, risk transfer, proof of deliver metrics. So capability does not accumulate. This is a political economy trap. A model survives because it reproduces itself, not because it produces transformation. Let me be blunt. This is not conspiracy. It's a system reproducing itself because the incentives reward activity, not transformation. And this is where your generation must be especially clear-eyed. If the relationship is not recalibrated, you will keep negotiating around projects when the real negotiation is about systems and about reclaiming the second function of multilateralism. Building block 6, the finance paradox. Why debt is the headline, not the diagnosis. Now we arrive at the heart of your team: debt and development finance. Africa's economic challenges are frequently narrated as debt distress, with the explanation that distress stems from excessive borrowing and fiscal mismanagement. This interpretation is too narrow, not to say misleading. Why misleading? Because it overlooks the deep driver: the failure of Africa to control and manage economic and financial flows. This is the finance paradox. Africa is resource rich, but cash poor. Value is generated, but predictable cash flows are not captured. Here is the direct link to misprofiling. When Africa is profiled as lacking resources, the policy response becomes more external finance, more borrowing, more aid, more projects. But if the real binding constraint is control of flows and institutional capability, then more external finance without fixing the leakage and systems simply increase vulnerability because it increases obligations while uncertainty remains. Let me give you the iceberg image. The visible tip: debt distress. Beneath the surface: lack of control over economic and financial flows. $500 billion in annual losses through leakage. Mobilization failure. The missing piece: systems and institutions, especially around domestic resource mobilization. So, to your team, diversification and innovative instruments, my political economy warning is simple. If you do not fix the iceberg, instruments float on the surface. You can diversify financing resources. You can innovate with performance-linked instruments. You can restructure debt. But if value continues to leak and institutions cannot convert value into predictable public capital, uncertainty will return. And debt will return with it. What young diplomats should take from these 6 building blocks? You now see the full architecture. Let me translate this into 3 diplomatic imperatives. The minimum intervention points to break the cycle. Imperative 1. Defend the second function of multilateralism. You must insist that multilateralism cannot only be an enabler of market expansion. It must again become a credible mechanism for correcting imbalances, regulatory fairness, risk pricing, tax cooperation, transparency. Why? Because these are the upstreams determinants of certainty. What this means in practice? When you negotiate debt relief, insist the conversation includes flow control, not just repayment schedules. Imperative 2. Recalibrate the Africa-UN relationship from ODA broker to preferred partner. The challenge is making the UN the preferred partner in Africa by rescuing function 2. That requires ending misprofiling on both sides. Africa must be recognized as capable and resourceful. The UN must be recognized for policy expertise and intangible assets, knowledge, data, trust, footprint, not as a financial intermediary. What this means in practice: don't ask for more ODA. Demand systems that capture value. Imperative 3. Make the finance paradox the center of the debt conversation. Debt negotiations that ignore leakage and flow control are incomplete. The real agenda is to move from surviving uncertainty to designing certainty, economically, financially, institutionally. What this means in practice: anchor every debt conversation in the 500 billion question. Where is the value going? And why can't we capture it? This is why I insist. This is not a technocratic agenda. It is a sovereignty agenda. To close, allow me to say, from surviving uncertainty to designing certainty. Let me close with the mindset test. Does Africa have the mindset to move from coping with uncertainty to shaping certainty? Does the UN system have the mindset to support Africa as a strategic actor, not a permanent crisis? Your generation of diplomats will answer that test, not in speeches, but in how you negotiate, how you name the structure, how you reject false profiles, how you anchor the debt conversation in the finance paradox, the struggle to convert value into predictable cash flows. Remanaging development is not about managing uncertainty better. It is about ending Africa's exclusion from certainty, economically, financially, and institutionally. Thank you.